So, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. Hello, my name is Giles Bailey, and I'm a policy advisor at Vianova, a micromobility management company based in France, but working across Europe. As part of our industry engagement and thought leadership work, we have been running a series of webinars on the most topical mobility issues. This is our sixth, and the other webinars are available online on our website. We have already been witnessing changes in mobility brought about by new business models, innovation, and micro-mobility. This is supporting as well as challenging classic public transport modes. And now we have the unprecedented turmoil in cities around the world brought about by the COVID crises. Much has occurred in micromobility in 2020, and 2021 looks to be a significant opportunity to embed shared micromobility in city thinking and transport services. But looking to 2021, what should we as innovators, city leaders, policy experts expect and encourage? Furthermore, what do we need to resist in order to make this an exciting opportunity and an opportunity not lost? So I'm going to give you a few thoughts before we get to our panel of speakers. So to start with, the beginning of the pandemic was the beginning of the pandemic was a huge challenge for the micromobility industry. And there were questions and debates about the future of the industry and how it dealt with the early parts of the crisis. But quite positively, a range of operators looked at new business models, whether in delivery, helping key workers in markets around the world, as we saw on these slides with Voi or Poppy, as well as we saw consolidation in the industry with Uber and Lime coming together earlier on in the year. But it's also been a huge challenge to the classic public transport industry. And again, there were questions about the future of classic public transport, how it can work in a post-COVID world, and what it means for demand and the base assumptions around public transport. There are also questions about localism and home working and new ways of working and how that will affect public transport and classic public transport going forward. And as we can see on the right-hand side in these slides, these are some statistics from Citymapper in the middle of December in 2020. Underlying demand for public transport has really been reduced in markets around the world. The differentials in North America versus Europe versus Asia, but the story is quite similar in terms of a massive reduction in demand. But it hasn't been fully negative though. There's some positive stories. And one of them is the continuing investment in classic public transport. And we're seeing this in a range of global markets. The example here is in Toulouse in southern France with the approval of a third metro line in the city. The trials of e-scooters going ahead in London later this winter, and then a major deployment of shared e-scooters. There have been issues around the tourism market, and clearly numbers are down quite significantly in markets around the world. But actually, this has ongoing impacts for cities, but actually for transport in cities as well. There have been issues around spacing and shared spacing, particularly in this new world, in terms of how we use the limited space in cities. And finally, in this quick summary, the European Green Deal. Major investment and a major focus across the continent in terms of shared, clean, green transport, and clearly leading to reductions in carbon emissions in the coming years. So to look at these issues, again, we have a series of panelists today. They're going to give relatively short presentations, and there'll be a few questions after each. And then after all three, we'll have a much broader debate. And of course, as usual, we're very keen to hear your views and your thoughts, so please put them into the question and answer box within Zoom, and we'll tackle those as we get into the latter parts of the debate. But firstly, I'd like to introduce Juho Kostanainen. Juho is the coordinator of Helsinki's Mobility Lab. The lab helps to test and develop new smart mobility services and technologies in the urban environment. He's been working in smart mobility-related research, innovation, and co-development for the last 10 years. Over to you, Juho.
Thank you very much. So, as said, I'm from the city of Helsinki, from the Economic Development Department there, or division, and working specifically on new solutions regarding smart mobility and the innovation activities. And if you move to the next slide, I'll give a little bit of a context in terms of what Helsinki is, how people move over here. So when it comes to the more central areas, downtown areas in Helsinki, the distances are relatively short. Walking, public transports are quite accessible and easy to cover shorter distances to get from place to place. And in fact, in the downtown area, most of the households actually don't have a car. And we also have one of, if not the most popular city bikes system in here, which is a station-based solution. So this is to say that people aren't tied to their cars, and different alternatives for the short and last mile trips are definitely something that have a place in here. And as you can see in the picture there, weather obviously has a significant impact as well. So last week, as winter showed up, the operators needed to hurry up and pick up their scooters from the streets or from the snow piles that had been plowed. If you move on to the next slide, please. So the situation with micromobility and specifically e-scooters in Helsinki, they were first really introduced here in 2019. I believe we had 6 different operators that year, one of which was a pilot together with or in collaboration with the Helsinki Region Transport Authority. And in 2020, we had 3 companies operating in the city. And it's going to be interesting to see what the situation will be this year, how many operators and what kind of services are in place. Obviously, the usage is mainly in the more central urban areas and varying based on the weather and time. As it gets colder and wet, and especially when there's snow, it's less pleasant, and especially the joyriding aspect is reduced significantly. In terms of legislation or regulations for e-scooters, they are more or less treated like bicycles. So the national regulation basically determines that you should follow pretty much the same rules as bicycles, used mainly on cycleways and so on. We don't have a specific permit process in Helsinki for this kind of services, so they are commercially operated. Any company basically can come in here, and rather than strict rules, the operation practices are defined through suggested guidelines based on dialogue with the different operators. So for example, how they should react when the winter comes, what kind of speed limits to apply, and when to pick up the devices out of the streets. And next, please. So regarding what kind of issues or risks there are with the e-scooters, obviously, as I believe in most cities, there are some challenges related to parking and riding habits that are in the public discussion when people leave the devices on bike paths or otherwise don't really behave in a more courteous manner with them. So while the city doesn't really enforce any specific parking areas and limitations for the scooters, we obviously do encourage the different companies and collaborates in finding different solutions for monitoring and managing how and where they're parked, whether it be sensing when they're tipped over, or perhaps the users taking a picture of the scooter when dropping them off, and things like this. And on the right-hand side of the slide, perhaps the more serious matter of accidents and the more serious head trauma. From the graph there, it's not from last year, but the year before, but it kind of shows how people behave. So a lot of the accidents happen in the nighttime, and in almost half the cases, there tends to be alcohol involved. So obviously that's something that is something that worries some people. Next slide, please. And now perhaps more related to what specifically I'm working on and what the general approach and interest the city of Helsinki has towards new mobility solutions. We have a rather long tradition when it comes to open data, open APIs, and public-private collaboration in developing new kind of solution services, kind of the mobility as a service type of approach and thinking. That's more data and better integration between different kind of services can provide better solutions to the actual users and citizens. And one way of supporting this kind of innovation and development is that through this mobility lab activity, we try to help experiment with the new novel ideas and solutions in the city. And one of these pilots we had last year was actually done with Vianova, with their platform. And as a really quick add, we actually have an open call for agile pilots ongoing at the moment as well. And next, please. Perhaps as the interest behind this kind of piloting for us, obviously data can be used to understand what is going on. So we really want to better understand the needs and the behavior of people in order to build a city that really works, because people don't tend to do what you want them to do unless it really meets their needs, as you can see from the path people have chosen here. Next. And then as a general development towards the future, while not specifically focused on micromobility and e-scooters, Helsinki is aiming for better, safer, and more comprehensive and direct accessibility throughout the city with bikes. And since the e-scooters and similar solutions apply to the same rules, this obviously supports the safer and better use of these kind of solutions as well. And I think that's the general approach we have. We try to support these new innovations as well as sustainable mobility in general. There's my really quick introduction to this. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Juho. There are a number of interesting issues in there that I'd like to talk about. I'll probably only pick on one at this point before we go to the next speakers. And that's actually on parking and parking control. And I suppose with the experience you've had in the last year, but also looking forward into 2021, is how you regulate parking, control parking, or even restrict it, seen as a critical issue for making shared micromobility work in Helsinki? Or are there reasons why you have a more relaxed attitude to the issue in the city?
Well, it's not a huge issue, in my opinion, just my personal opinion, yet, at least. And on the other hand, it's not that straightforward because, as mentioned, the regulations are essentially the same as for bikes. If we were to offer city space for specific e-scooter parking, for example, we would need to rent that city street to somebody to really run that system, or we would have to separate the e-scooters from how they are perceived as bicycles. And of course, one thing that kind of supports the keeping our hands off of these kind of activities is the fact that there's a lot of private land as well. So for example, shopping malls are a relatively natural partner who has the land and is located where a lot of this use is happening, and they might have their own interest in making sure that their entrances are clean, so to speak.
And I just want to have one quick follow-on. Is it also part of the culture in Helsinki to perhaps be much more cognizant of where you would put a device on this pavement and on the street?
I think at the moment, the idea is more educating people and hoping that they follow reasonable practices rather than, frankly, being idiots and leaving them in stupid places. And it's worked rather well so far, but there is also some public discussion as well as some political discussion that the city probably will start discussing more and more with the Ministry of Transport and Communications on whether there should be more enforced rules or stronger means of managing the parking situation if and when it's considered an issue. But as mentioned, collaboration and discussion with the operators is at the moment the main thing, and that's something that works very well, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to hold on my further questions, and to the audience, keep your written questions coming in. We'll get to them later on in the overall debate. But I'm going to move on to the next speaker now, who is Sebastian Sliebusch from Dott, and we were just talking about the operators. So Sebastian is responsible for city expansion at Dott in markets across Europe. He's an urban geographer by education, and he's been a veteran of the micromobility industry over the last 10 years, launching bike and scooter sharing schemes with Nextbike, Jump by Uber, and now Dott. Over to you, Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill, and apologies for this little technical glitch at the beginning. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to present Dott, and good afternoon to everyone. Good morning to our friends in the US. Yeah, Dott, the trusted and responsible European micromobility operator. Our mission is basically to free our cities with clean rides for everyone. Please, next slide. And today we already operate 30,000 vehicles in 16 cities across 6 countries. We've been very careful and selective in our go-to-market approach and focus on cities where we can build strong and lasting relationships with public and private stakeholders. And in those cities, we're known as the trusted operator by cities. We've been selected, for example, by the city of Paris as the best among 16 other candidates. We've also been chosen by city of Lyon, Milano, Monza, Rome, Turin, just to name a few among others. And yeah, we're profitable on every single ride. We're here for the long term. We never withdrew from a city. So if we are entering a city, it's a very careful, considerable decision. And then we want to make sure that we are providing a sustainable long-term business there and service. And yeah, for this, we're well funded by the largest European tech funds. And our environmental responsibility is deeply embedded into our DNA. So we're carbon neutral on every single ride since the very beginning. We throw away nothing and we recycle and reuse everything. Next slide, please. So if I just give you a couple of commitments, what we're standing for. So our values that we are running our operations 100% in-house for maximum safety and accountability. So all our operations, they're executed by fully employed local teams. We've also industrialized our charging depots over time with the highest health and safety standards. Then we have very professionally trained mechanics, which do quality checks after every 10th ride to ensure the maximum reliability and the safety here. And also our street teams, our street patrollers, they are highly responsive to reported issues. The rebalancing we do, we try wherever possible to use electric cargo bikes and electric trailers. Next slide, please. The next commitment we stand for is that we are socially responsible for all. not only for our employees, not only for our users, but also for our non-user or for the non-users. And so starting with the employees, we've never exploited any gig economy workers. So all our employees, they are fully employed with social securities, with fair payment, with shareholding arrangements, and we're committed to diversity and inclusion. And obviously 0% gender gap pay is also obvious. So I think that's where we really set the standards in the industry. And yeah, we're providing our service at the most affordable prices, which includes also a complementary accident insurance. Juho has shared some insights about accidents in Helsinki. That happens in other cities as well. There's a reducing trend overall in the industry, and we're approaching the levels of bicycles, and with the aim to even reduce it further. But accidents do happen, and yeah, we're providing complementary insurance for that. Together with highest sanitation standards in these COVID times. And then our commitment to the cities and to all other residents in the cities is that we are ensuring there's no street clutter. We're ensuring the pedestrian safety through a very tight operational control and through our smart parking technology, which I will tell you a bit about in a second. Next slide. So I mentioned already our DNA around operation on environmental responsibility is deeply embedded. We are carbon neutral on every single ride. We're focusing on a very high longevity of hardware. So the current generation extends the vehicle lifetime beyond 3 years. The majority of the parts, so more than 90% of all parts, are reused to extend the lifetime further. We're also, through our algorithms and standard operation procedures, we're reducing the vehicle kilometers traveled. We're also using swappable batteries in our new fleets now, and have pledged together with other operators to only exclusively use swappable batteries for new vehicles to be deployed. And our service vehicles are 100% electric, powered by 100% renewable energy. And during lockdown, during the first lockdown, but also today, we are supporting local communities with free trips for frontline workers, for example. Next slide. So there's a very hot topic on data. So obviously, we are fully transparent with our city partners because, we are sharing the same. The same vision. No? We want to change and improve the urban mobility and to create a better ecosystem for micromobility, and therefore data is really essential. So we share real-time data and historical data via the globally defined data standards, GBFS and MDS. We're the first European operator to do so. We also generate insights on trip patterns and on user safety, on behavioral change through regular performance reports, and enrich this with third-party research to enrich the knowledge about the user demographics and also their mobility habits. Next slide, and we're coming close to the end. So here you see the results from our smart parking technology, where we feel we have solved the issue. We've really cracked the nut here in Paris. Many of you know Paris in 2018-19 has been a test bed for many micromobility operators, and the call to action to remove the chaos was very strong. So we have come up with a solution which we call smart parking. So anyone who is returning the vehicle to a dedicated parking bay, which Paris has provided 2,500 across the whole city. They are forced to make a picture at the end of the ride, so that behind the scene, the system can check and verify the appropriateness of the parking location, and sanctions it if we detect a violation. And that led to a 97% parking compliance. Last slide, or last two slides. So what are the lessons learned? That was one of the themes here today. And I think 2020 has demonstrated that micromobility is a crucial part of the public mobility ecosystem. And we see here during the first lockdown, we have kept our services open. It has been an essential service for many people who were reluctant to use public transport, but we also wanted to make sure that not everyone is using the car again. So, and then we also see that after the lockdown, micromobility services really bounced back very strongly and became a true complement to public transport. So, for example, in Lyon, we on afternoon peak hours, we're carrying the equivalent of 5 high-capacity bus corridors running every 10 minutes service. So that's quite enormous. And finally, this comes through. Next and last slide. This is basically thanks, and this is here an opportunity for me also to express the deep gratitude to the pioneering cities who are taking the lead on this urban transformation and who are providing better facilities, safer facilities to ride and park safely with bikes, with e-scooters, with all forms of micromobility in the cities. And I'm hopeful that this positive trend will continue. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Sebastian. Thank you very much. A whole series of questions in there. And again, to the audience, please keep your own questions coming in. We'll group them together as we get to the, after the next speaker as well. But Sebastian, clearly you have some specific lessons learned from managing our way through, or managing your way through the COVID crises and the various waves. What are some of the kind of the key lesson you would say in terms of how you get that bounce back in demand in the cities that you're working in? How do you really kind of prepare for the next stage of the concern around the public around COVID and coming back to shared micromobility?
I mean, in general, the key for us was that we remained open during the lockdown, as I said, and that meant that there was a certain availability and reliability of services available, and this is key, you know, for micromobility. So you need to have density, you need to have a good level of availability. Coming back again to the very positive benchmark of Paris, now we see that every 100 meters on average, there's a dedicated parking bay for e-scooters. That means that on average, users don't need to walk longer than 1 minute, 1.5 minutes to reach the next scooter. And that's really the kind of density our own internal research has shown with our users. The users prefer. No, they don't want to walk too long distance to reach the nearest scooter or to return it. And that requires a lot of collaboration between the landowners and the cities and the operators alike. So here also the impact of data is very, very useful to demonstrate the effects and the true patterns of our users.
Excellent. I probably want to come back to the data point a bit later on, but I'll probably move to Sherata, our third speaker, and then we'll move to kind of a more general discussion. So I'd like to introduce Sherata Strasmore. She is the Shared Micromobility Planner at Washington, D.C.'s Department of Transport in the U.S. She's been on the team leading the highly active MOBIT program on shared micromobility in the city over the last few years. Welcome, Sherata.
Thanks. Thank you, Giles, and thank you, Villanova, for the opportunity to speak here today. As Giles said, I'm the Shared Micromobility Planner in Washington, D.C., and my primary job is to work on the permit application process, manage the permit compliance and enforcement for dockless bike and scooter companies. Next slide. DC has been an earlier adopter of micromobility. Dockless bikes first launched in DC in September of 2017. At that point, DC had been operating the Capital Bike Share system for 7 years since 2010. So people were already familiar with shared bikes through Docked Bike Share. These dockless bikes were traditional pedal bicycles that were joined by dockless scooters in summer of 2018. In January 2019, DC launched its first year-long permit for dockless bikes and scooters. And in January 2020, DC launched a second year-long permit for dockless bikes. Scooters received a permit extension, which ended up being for the remainder of 2020 due to the public health emergency. For 2021, dockless vehicle operators that have held permits to operate dockless bikes and scooters in the District of Columbia in 2020 had the opportunity to receive extensions of current permits through December 31st, 2021. And Dott reissued amended terms and conditions addressing feedback from riders and non-riders related to sidewalk riding, rider safety education, and proper parking, among other concerns. Just looking at this timeline as a reminder, the history of dockless shared scooters doesn't extend back very far. This timeline shows that there was less than 2 years of uninterrupted service before the public health emergency started and disrupted service. The world has changed, and post-pandemic micromobility may look very different. Looking at the data, a lot of routines have been disrupted. A lot of people who are going places regularly are no longer leaving their homes. And this is an opportunity to change the way people plan for and take trips. This is an opportunity to change, to shift people away from more carbon-heavy modes. I have 3 points that I want to highlight as food for thought as we think about what the post-pandemic world will look like. Next slide, please. Number 1, the relationship between the city and the operators. The US micromobility market has been trending towards RFPs, requests for proposals, and opportunities for a city to select a single or a few operators for their markets. This process, rather than a permit process, offers the opportunity for selection that is within set parameters. Most programs have been frozen in time through the pandemic by local governments focused on other priorities. As they begin to thaw, we may see some big ideas from regulators and observe the shift to fewer companies per market with stricter requirements. Backing up from this, the reason why DC regulates shared scooters is because they are stored in public space, and we do it through a public right-of-way occupancy permit. Shared mobility in general requires the use of public space that is calculated to be of benefit to the city. The city uses fees to offset the negative externalities of the shared vehicles being in public space. Another trend to look out for is the shifting of these externalities to other modes like private vehicles and partnering with for exclusivity or even paying for specific terms with dockless vehicle operators. Most of the docked bike share system assets are owned by the government that contracts out operations, giving the city more control over operational standards and creating service level agreements for needs ranging from station rebalancing to parking standards. Docked bike shares are expensive to start, requiring stations and equipment. Partnering with a mobility company that could bring the equipment for the use of public space would hold some appeal for those who don't already have docked bike share. Next slide. Number 2, vehicle form. There are limited standards when it comes to expectations around stem strength, battery testing, exposed wires, and wheel size. The way vehicles are described at a local, state, and federal, along with global level, is limited and not standardized. All this has led to a proliferation of vehicle types as companies both use the standard models offered by manufacturers such as Ninebot and create bespoke scooters, designing from the wheels up, tweaking designs for rideability. As a city, DC has a definition for the category that is scooters, electric mobility devices, that no other city has, a requirement for vehicles that weigh 60 pounds or less. In the US, a few other cities have the requirement that vehicles be 100 pounds or less. This requirement came from thinking about vehicles, thinking about tipped over scooters, and what citizen is going to ride a vehicle that weighs about the same as a 2-month-old baby horse. This standard has limited who can operate in the district, but it's not a federal standard. It's not a state standard. Creating this standard that doesn't have an equal across several markets makes it difficult and frankly less desirable to operate. Things to look out for when it comes to vehicle form. Vehicle definitions and what category the vehicle will be in on the local, state, and federal level. Wheel size and material in concert with the quality of your roadway. And my personal favorite, quality of batteries and battery safety practices. Nothing can extinguish a program faster than a fiery blaze, even if it doesn't burn anything else down. Next slide. The last point I want to bring up is the bigger picture. Micromobility exists in a shared form in the city environment because it offers other options in a transportation-rich environment. There were over 5 million dockless scooter trips in 2019 in the District of Columbia, a transit-rich environment with about 750,000 residents. Shared mobility is the option to take a different trip to work, to play, to home. It is a slice of transportation pie, and the pie is shifting. In the beginning of Dockless, a lot of the conversation was around the first mile, last mile trips. But now as we're thinking of coming out of the COVID posture, people have changed. I know I have. The amount of trips that we have to take may have shifted. And those who are out taking essential trips have jobs that don't allow them to work remotely. And this is something that we have to think about when we supply and subtract mobility options. Something that I've observed in the district, even before COVID, is how people who started on shared scooters have purchased their own vehicles. I personally decided to become a bike commuter after trying shared bikes for a few months. The gateway to private micromobility is shared mobility. As people become more clear about their post-COVID needs, they may move to more private micromobility to maintain reliability in their transport. And who better to do that than companies who are already providing vehicles that the riders are using, whether through purchases, short-term and long-term leases.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sherata. That's really, really interesting. A range of really kind of fascinating points in there. I'm going to pick on one before we get into the more general discussion. And that's this issue of your, as you say, the cost benefits of public space and how you manage them. As a city, or more generally in the US, how did you come to that decision that that would need to be done? And is it controversial? And how are you then managing what those costs might look like to the operators?
Yeah, so we calculated our public space fees based on the fees for sidewalk cafes at the time. We haven't increased fees since we started the program. And one of the reasons why our fees are so low is because we have a low-income customer plan program that's required by all operators. So essentially, we view it as a balance between having this requirement for free trips to the cost of operating in public space. It hasn't been very debatable, except for the diehards who strongly believe that there shouldn't be any scooters in public space. So it's been a balance, and I think it's been interesting to see how as other programs who put in their fees in later have had much higher fees. But I think it's downtrending now as markets contract and there's not as many rides.
On this point, I'd like to open it to the other two speakers as well. Fees for shared space. Comments, perhaps start with Sebastian, then we'll go to Juho. Is that something you'd welcome or you're wary of in a European context?
I would say I need to give it a bit more differentiated view. I cannot just say I completely welcome it or I completely oppose it. I think it's to do with what we're using the fees for. So in Paris, for example, we're also bound to pay fees, but these fees have been paid or have been reinvested into a better infrastructure. So, and in this case, then we're creating a way better ecosystem and a way better opportunity, which also drives up the business. So I think that's very well spent money there. But then on the other side, if the fees are just meant to cover some holes in the budget, and I see it a little bit differently. So for example, if you calculate or if you compare the fees for the usage of the shared space with the sidewalk cafes, for example, like you did, you don't really appreciate the positive externalities the micromobility delivers, while taking out people from a motorized individual car usage. So maybe we need to also factor in these positive effects on the wider policy goals of the city, and maybe then the balance will be even a net positive, where we would actually need it to be supported with funds because we're delivering such a valuable service. Maybe it's just a hypothesis, but.
And Juho, would you like to add anything more on that point?
Maybe as the general trend that more flexible use of the urban space, whether it's streets, curbside, or other urban city spaces, is something that we've been starting to think more and more. And for example, one of the central squares in Helsinki was turned into a space for restaurants as a response to the COVID situation last summer. So I think more innovative and more shared use of the different places is something that will happen more and more, whether it's taking that space from cars or just coming up with new solutions and new rules on how to use it. That's an open question so far, but I think something will happen. What kind of fees they are and who's responsible for that is yet another question, I think.
Okay, thank you. Again, I have a kind of a book-ended question, or a set of questions here. One is on how do you protect against underage riding, but actually there's a follow-on question on targeting older users. And perhaps if you go through all three, perhaps starting with Juho to start with.
Me first?
Yeah, if you want to go first. So underage riding and maybe targeting older users.
Yeah, well, I would say that from the Helsinki perspective, that's something that as a city, we don't really do. I mean, we're not regulating how they are operated. That's something that comes from the national regulations, and the operators need to ensure that their users comply with the rules that they and the legislation puts in place.
Okay, maybe Sebastian, do you want to go next then?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in from the operator's point of view. So in some markets, we're relying on technologies which require the ID or a license or driving license check. So this is mainly following local or national legislation. So in Lyon, for example, it has been a mandatory requirement in the tender procedure to, and has been an award criteria for the winning operators. So since September this year, we've implemented the mandatory ID verification check. So anyone who's younger than 18 is not able to use our services there. That's not we haven't implemented this anywhere, but we're following national legislation here.
And Sherata has the US example.
In DC, we have a DC limit of 16, and the companies have a limit of 18 because underage people are not able to sign contracts. That's at least what I think it is. So most of them require driver's licenses or some form of ID. Obviously, kids get around that. They take their parents' ID. Their parents give them their ID. They rent them a scooter. We don't do any enforcement on it. The thing that really gets me is when somebody has their baby on a scooter. That's when I say, no, please don't do that. We have a helmet requirement for those under 16 and under. So that's obviously not being adhered to when there's underage riders that are particularly underage. When it comes to the older demographic, I think that there's vehicle forms that can really encourage older people to try scooters. Something like a Razor scooter with a really large wheel and even a seat can make a difference when they're thinking about trying it. And then also something that we've definitely seen from our operators is doing these first ride events. So not purely possible during COVID, but before COVID, you would go out to a parking lot and let people ride scooters around, and then they would get more comfortable with it and more comfortable with the idea of like how you would operate it on the roadway. And seeing that and being able, then there's no other vehicle form that we expect people to take their first ride totally blind on a roadway and be completely inexperienced, right? Like you don't just get in a car and like drive it away for the first time. You don't get on a bike and know how to ride it. You have like a process where your parents like push you up a hill and you start pedaling and then you figure out how to balance. I think these first ride events are really important, especially for older people who are less comfortable and less physically able to learn how to operate the vehicles.
Sorry, Sebastian, do you want to add more?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, research shows that nearly 40% of all the accidents, they occur among the first 5 rides. So that's really where we need to focus on. And we have created some consistent training courses, both online and offline, to facilitate better knowledge of this, of the rules of the road, and also to provide practical knowledge on using these devices.
Excellent. Again, I'd like to move to one of the key questions for the overall debate, so we have enough time to debate this one. And it's really around, for 2021 or 2022, what do we expect are the key issues in making shared micromobility a core part of the urban transport system and schemes? And Sebastian, you mentioned data, which perhaps is one of them. But again, how do we make sure or support the integration of shared micromobility into the overall transport scheme? And perhaps, Sherata, do you want to go first? And then we'll go the other two.
Sure. So I think what's really important is the TDM strategies related to trip planning. So making sure that when somebody thinks about where they're going and what trip they're going to be taking, they look. You don't just go straight for the bus that you know you can take that will be there in 10 minutes. You have to, we're going to have this opportunity where people are resetting the way they live, right? I haven't gone to work in 9 months. And so when I get back and have to go to work, like, I'm going to think about how I get there. So I just wanted to highlight that there will be an opportunity to shift people away from their cars, away from their parking that they were paying $200, $300 a month for, into another mode. Because also they might not expect to go to the office as often. I think we're experiencing a big shift in the way the world works.
Excellent. And Juho, do you want to provide your response as well then next?
Yeah, sure. I think one aspect from a user point of view is that there's perhaps fairly limited amount of transparent information of even the availability of these services, since they don't tend to be integrated into single applications. So if you wanted to know where is the nearest e-scooter, you would have to go through each and every operator. And for the average person, they probably don't have any idea what all the companies are called, for instance. So I think to really make it a reliable option rather than just an opportunistic situation that you might take it as you spot one of those devices on the street, so that you could rely that you more likely after taking the bus or a train, you will have something nearby and you'll find it easily. It's something that probably even data and availability information can help. But then I think the next perhaps bigger issue might be, how will it be made feasible in terms of pricing? I mean, if I have to pay for the public transportation and then on top of that, the last mile trip portion kind of doubles the cost of the entire trip, I think that might be an issue. So I'm not sure if the price point is where it should be. Hopefully all the companies have managed to find the right sweet spot that they can provide the service and the users are happy. And that's something to be seen, I think.
Excellent. And I think clearly you've brought in the issue of mobility as a service mass, that integration of services, which, again, interesting to see whether we can make that much more of a reality in shared micromobility going forward into the year.
Well, I'm from Helsinki, I have to. I
was about to say that as well, but also, Sebastian, you talked about price, and clearly that's a way into the operators. What's your thoughts on integration with the rest of the wider public transport network?
Yes, yeah, 2 thoughts. So first of all, I'm astonished, to be honest, that there's still the concern about providing the information on availability. I mean, GBFS is such a widespread standard, which every operator I know at least is supporting. So it should be very easy for mass platform owners to integrate the availability of the vehicles and make it visible. So if that's still a concern, then we need to think about how, as industry associations, for example, we can facilitate this, or through more information and education about the availability of this standard. But I believe that many people here in this audience are aware of GBFS or even MDS as data standards. On the pricing side, I see there's an interesting trajectory. Let's say if we see the traditional station-based bike sharing systems, which had clearly higher infrastructure costs to install all the stations there, but then typical characteristics of these services were that they were very affordable. So for 30, 50 euros a year, you were able to get an annual pass, which allowed you unlimited amount of free 30-minute strips. So that's an unbeatable offer, no? If you have a good availability and network across the city. But that also means these services, they are highly subsidized. And we see, for example, in London, Transport for London, there has been discussions recently about scrapping the systems in order to save the public investments or the public subsidies there. That would be a disaster. No? So I think there's, and on the other side, scooter companies have been able to crack the profitability without additional subsidies in the first place, without reliance on other forms of revenues like sponsorship, advertising, etc. But this also comes at a cost, and this cost here is basically that the average individual price per trip is significantly higher than a free 30 minutes ride on a station-based bike sharing scheme. So there's this gap, a mismatch here, and it's on the one hand side we have policy objectives saying we want to make services affordable. Yes, I totally subscribe to that. We also want to make provide a wider geographical spread across the city to also serve underserved areas of the city. Totally subscribe to that. But then these bear the risk that the operations won't be profitable anymore. So how can we outbalance this? And here we come again into the topic of service fees. Is the positive gain to create an affordable service, ubiquitously available service, socially higher than paying fees to operate on public land to the operators or not? And how can we calculate this? I think this is a crucial question here. Maybe in some areas, in some cities, operators will pay because they only operate in a very lucrative center. But maybe in other cities, operators are incentivized to offer their services at a much lower price and bigger service area. And then maybe they're getting some support.
Excellent. I want to offer across the three speakers as well the issue of the challenges we may need to resist. That maybe one or two things you think as a collective industry to make sure shared micromobility is embedded, the thing we need to not let happen. Is there anything that any of the three of you would like to immediately come up and say that is a risk? Perhaps Hugo, I think you've unmuted yourself. Did you have something you wanted to
add? No, I didn't, but I might as well come up with something. Yeah, I think the approach we've had in Helsinki, the dialogue with the operators, and kind of thinking what really meets the needs of the users as well as what needs the city has in terms of what kind of solutions we are happy to promote or collaborate with, is something that has been a good approach. And I think keeping things in check in terms of how the operators themselves manage things and don't kind of force us as a city to put too many heavy regulations or enforcements in place, that is a good thing. And I think something like just communication and education of the users, as mentioned, helping with the first rides, teaching how to use them and ensuring that people know that they're not supposed to be riding on the sidewalks. Those are the sort of simple things that, well, it's a good starting point, but it can take us quite far, I think.
And Sebastian and Sherata, go ahead, Sherata. I think you wanted to go.
Yeah, I agree, Juho, that good actors lead to better regulation in the long run. Thinking about this question, I think that the major issue for us to think about is having good actors, is having operators that are trusted and who are able to operate within the parameters of the city. It makes a big difference when you're arguing that something should continue, that it's going well. Like, it's much easier to argue for something if it's going well. The other thing that I think is a dream, but it's a dream I can keep dreaming, is integrated payment. So thinking about how you pay for that metro trip, how you pay for that bus trip, and integrating it with the docked bike share, with the dockless vehicles, having a one fee system where you can even price out what the trip is going to cost you before you start it. The mobility as a service type of platform. I think after we've explored this option with WMATA, our local our local transit authority, I don't know if that's even ever going to be a possibility, but it's where that's how you embed something, is the payment, and making it easy and making it thoughtless for the user who's making the decision.
Excellent. And Sebastian, operators acting well, I think it's over to you.
Yeah, I think that's key. And I mean, we've seen a lot of consolidation in the industry, and we've seen also that many, let's say, gold diggers were trying to jump on the big next wave and have failed to deliver positive effects there. And then you have, on the other hand, you have committed companies who are who know how things need to be developed over time. And this is not, I mean, we're talking about a massive change here, which has the potential to, and is already disrupting the mobility system for the next couple of decades. No? And this is a long-term opportunity for us to create a very positive change in our cities. And I think those operators who know this and who have the vision, it's about vision, it's about values, and these values, they are typically aligned more or less, but in generally to a very high degree, with those public objectives about sustainable urban mobility. So I think if you're looking just behind pitch decks and really have the deep conversation with people in the industry, you can kind of see who has the heart at the right part. Huh?
Okay, thank you. And we're coming relatively close to the hour. There are many, many questions I wanted to ask, but I'm going to probably finish off with what is the major data gap that we need to close as we head into 2021 in terms of shared micromobility? Who wants? Okay, Sherata, I think you've gone first, so you've been muted first. Go ahead.
I think I'm going to go for Juho's version of having publicly available data. So looking at GBFS 2.0, there's a deep links. There's a way to click through, have a link that clicks through directly to an app to perform a rental. I think that having this linkage will create an opportunity for people to rent vehicles when previously they thought it was too much, too far, too much effort.
Excellent. So I'm going to pass to Juho, over to you. Data gap.
Yeah, I think, as it was mentioned at some parts, and I think in some of the chats as well, I think the standards and technical possibilities are there. It's more a matter of how the different companies want to collaborate. And if it becomes a question of how can cities push the providers from a city perspective, I think it's more a matter of, if things work out well enough, we don't want to have to take clear role and mandate the companies to do something. And we don't want to build our own platform to manage things in a way. So I think hopefully there will be a manner in which the companies themselves find benefits among one another. And of course, taking into account the privacy issues, GDPRs and things like that complicate things a little bit more when it comes to the real-time information.
Okay, thank you. And Sebastian, and if you could do your final thoughts as well, Sebastian, on after the data gap.
Well, I think there's already a lot of data available in theory, I mean, but with a lot of cities also in practice. And I think the road towards standardization has helped a lot to balance and manage the expectations. So I think particularly with MDS, there's a lot of insight cities can gain from the operations, both real time and historically. Obviously, there's a gap, I would say, in the ability to implement this. And I think one of the issues for us, from our perspective, is that we are often confronted with lots of data requests where it's not necessarily obvious what is the purpose to share this data, and then we often get into potentially GDPR issues, because we need to clearly demonstrate what the data we're sharing is used for. If there's a legitimate use, yeah, perfect, then it can be shared. But so we need to probably think a bit of objective driven, like what do I want to achieve, and then think about what kind of data is there to support this. But I think the data is all there. We just need to make sense of it.
Excellent. Any final thoughts then for the overall webinar? Sebastian, you go first.
Final thoughts on the webinar?
Yeah, any final thoughts for the overall audience?
Well, no, yeah, I think following up on the last point, I think there's a good chance now that we are implementing a standard which, where we don't, as operators, where we don't need to always reinvent the wheel, where we can also work collaboratively with city representatives, with public authorities, with operators, with innovators to shape it further. So I don't think this is already the final development of the standard, but possibly we will see further innovation there. And working on this together, I think this is a good, positive outlook for 2021 to come.
And Juho, any final thoughts overall?
Overall, I would say this has been quite interesting, and I'm very interested to see what kind of mobility solutions we'll be seeing next year and in the future, in terms of the devices, how many wheels they have, are they flying, and so on, what kind of service models there will be, and so on. And interested to see what's happening in Washington in general as well, not just in terms of mobility.
And on that note, Sherata, any your final thoughts?
I think 2020 was a really rough year for scooter operators. And I look forward to 2021 being a better year. I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth, a lot of opportunity for innovation and vehicle form, and hopefully it'll be good. And I look forward to seeing what people come up with.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Sherata, Sebastian, and Juho for joining us today and sharing some of their thoughts on the opportunities and the challenges for shared micromobility as we go into 2021. Generally, please, you can listen to the earlier ViaNova webinars via our website, and you can also read our European City Policy Guidelines, which talk about a range of issues for cities in terms of rolling out shared micromobility. And you can also access these documents via our website and LinkedIn page as well. There's a satisfaction survey that's come up on the webinar, and please fill it in. It kind of helps us think about the future and what we do next. And our next webinar will be later on in the winter. We don't have the exact date yet, but we're looking at managing urban space using the lessons from shared micromobility and how we can make cities work better for deliveries as well as other transport services. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. And keep safe in a challenging world, but have a very good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.